Imagine being, without a doubt, the absolute greatest musical genius the world has ever seen. We are talking about a man who, at the absolute peak of his career, earned a staggering fortune, placing him squarely in the top 5% of society. A prodigy who, at the tender age of 14, walked right into the Vatican, listened to highly classified, forbidden choral music just once, and perfectly transcribed the entire complex score from memory, a feat that is biologically unbelievable. Yet, if you stop someone on the street today and ask them to describe the end of this man's life, you will hear a totally different narrative. You will hear the story that Hollywood so brilliantly, but disastrously, etched into our collective consciousness. You will be told that this unmatched genius spent his final years as a shivering, forgotten pauper, begging his friends for spare change. You will hear the classic starving artist myth that he was slowly poisoned to death by a jealous, mediocre rival. And finally, that his body was unceremoniously dumped into a muddy, unmarked mass grave while his wife abandoned him. That is the myth. But the reality is infinitely more fascinating, considerably more complex, and completely shatters everything you thought you knew. It is the ultimate historical paradox. Society has an overwhelming tendency to romanticize suffering in its artists. We cling to this Dickensian image of the starving, misunderstood creator, dictating his own requiem to his murderer in the dead of night. But when we strip away that thick layer of theatrical varnish, open the 18th century archives, study the raw financial ledgers, analyze modern epidemiological reports, and read his unfiltered personal letters, a completely different human being emerges. The tragedy of the Hollywood narrative is that it flattens a brilliantly complex, highly flawed, economically savvy, and culturally rebellious individual into a passive victim. Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. Today, we are taking you on a comprehensive, unvarnished journey into the actual breathing reality of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. If you crave the raw truth beneath the theatrical varnish of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with your fellow history lovers as we reconstruct the life of a legend from the archives up. Our mission is singular: to dissect a massive stack of primary and secondary sources and reconstruct the actual truth. We will read from his deeply personal, sometimes shockingly inappropriate historical letters. We will audit 18th century financial records, follow the money to see exactly where his wealth went, bring in modern epidemiological studies to diagnose a 200-year-old cold case, and consult centuries of biographical research. We are going to dismantle the highly fictionalized world of the movie Amadeus and separate the man from the myth. Let us pull back the curtain and unpack this right from the origin point. Before Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was a rebellious, freewheeling, independent artist in Vienna, he was a heavily managed, fiercely controlled child star who served as the breadwinner for his entire family before he even lost his baby teeth. But here is the major surprise that completely upends the traditional perspective. Wolfgang wasn't even the only child prodigy in his own household. To truly comprehend the Mozart phenomenon, you must first analyze the architect who designed it, his father, Leopold Mozart. Leopold was an incredibly complex, driven, and frustrated figure. Professionally, he was a court musician, a highly skilled violinist, and a deputy Kapellmeister in Salzburg. But he carried a massive amount of personal baggage. His psychology was deeply shaped by early financial trauma. He had effectively abandoned his family in Augsburg, walking away from a stable bookbinding business to pursue the precarious life of a musician. This act of rebellion was so severe that his own mother entirely cut him out of her will and denied him his dowry. Right from the start, Leopold dealt with the sting of parental rejection and the overwhelming pressure to prove that abandoning his family's trade was worth it. Professionally, Leopold hit a solid brick wall. He was repeatedly passed over for the prestigious head Kapellmeister position in Salzburg, and a prominent biographer points out that Leopold essentially failed to make a lasting mark as a primary composer himself. While his written treatise on violin fundamentals brought him a respectable level of fame, Leopold was a man of intense ambition and considerable arrogance. So, when he looked at his children and realized the raw, astonishing cognitive material he had to work with, a massive psychological shift occurred. He essentially stopped being a primary musician and transformed into a ruthless manager, packing his kids into wooden carriages and dragging them on grueling, physically devastating tours across the dirt roads of Europe. But the person who originally ignited this traveling circus wasn't Wolfgang. It was his older sister, Maria Anna, affectionately called Nannerl. Nannerl, 4.5 years older than Wolfgang, was undeniably the original prodigy. By age 13, she was universally considered one of the most skillful, technically perfect pianists in all of Europe. On those early aristocratic tours, she was the main event, regularly receiving higher billing on promotional materials than her brother. Leopold began rigorously instructing her on the harpsichord when she was 7, while 3-year-old Wolfgang simply watched. The cognitive science of early childhood development is crucial here. Wolfgang idolized his sister, standing utterly mesmerized by her hands. Primary sources heavily suggest that observing Nannerl play, listening to her practice, and watching her execute complex fingerings initially inspired the toddler Wolfgang to reach up and pick out harmonious thirds on the keyboard. Completely isolated from normal childhoods and surrounded by kings and aristocrats, the siblings formed an incredibly intense, insulated bond. To survive the touring, they created a secret, highly developed imaginary world called the Kingdom of Bach. Ruling as king and queen with intricate secret languages and geographical maps, it is a poignant detail of 2 exhausted children trying to carve out a sliver of control in a reality where every hour of their day was monetized by their father. The physical toll of 18th century travel was arduous, bone-rattling, and profoundly dangerous. In 1765, while touring in The Hague, the fragility of this operation was exposed when both children contracted what medical analysts believe was typhus fever. They were brought to the absolute precipice of death. The bacteria ravaged Nannerl's system so severely that doctors gave up all hope, and she was formally administered the Catholic last rites. The church was literally preparing her soul for the afterlife. Miraculously, she pulled through. And here, the sources provide a starkly mathematical display of Leopold's affection. Upon Nannerl's recovery, Leopold ordered 6 masses in thanksgiving. Shortly after, Wolfgang caught the exact same fever, almost died, and recovered. For Wolfgang, Leopold ordered 9 masses for the male heir, 6 for the female. A devastatingly clear metric of the father's internal valuation system. As a noted historian points out, in this calculated disparity, we detect the early seeds of the deep conflicts that would tear the sibling relationship apart. Leopold was measuring their worth based on future earning potential in a deeply patriarchal society. No matter how flawless Nannerl's technique was, the moment she reached marriageable age, around 17 or 18, Leopold abruptly pulled the plug on her touring career. Exhibiting a child as a musical marvel was a charming curiosity, but putting a grown, marriageable woman on a public stage to generate profit was considered highly scandalous and borderline socially indecent. Because she wasn't an opera singer, Leopold systematically forced her into domestic passivity, ordering her to remain in provincial Salzburg. give basic piano lessons to generate supplementary income, and quietly wait for a financially advantageous marriage. This systemic erasure of genius makes us seriously challenge the mythological narrative of Wolfgang's innate supremacy. Wolfgang absorbed everything by looking over Nannerl's shoulder, internalizing her rigorous routines, and learning from her triumphs. Modern musicologists debate if his monumental genius is, mechanically, a product of his sister's foundational influence, without Nannerl translating their father's rigid, pedagogical methods into concepts a toddler could grasp. Wolfgang's neurological development would have tracked differently. Wolfgang implicitly acknowledged her brilliance. Long into adulthood, he continued mailing her his freshly composed concertos because he valued her peer critique and knew she was one of the few musicians in Europe who possessed the technical mastery to play them correctly. From a modern ethical standpoint, Leopold is the prototype for the most ruthless reality TV stage parent imaginable, exploiting his children until their immune systems collapsed and entirely benching his daughter the second she aged out of her marketable demographic. But in the 18th century, it was brutal pragmatism. Within a feudal patriarchal economy, only Wolfgang had the legal and social potential to eventually secure a highly paid, permanent court appointment as a Kapellmeister. Women simply could not hold that job, and such an appointment was the only way to guarantee the family's financial security for decades. Therefore, as a strict investment strategy, all resources shifted into Wolfgang's basket. He became the sole vessel carrying his father's historically frustrated ambitions. And to his credit, Wolfgang completely delivered. This transitions perfectly to one of the most astonishing stories in Western music. With Nannerl left behind, Wolfgang's grueling education accelerated. During the Italian tours between 1769 and 1773, Italy being the undisputed epicenter of the musical world, where mastering opera was a mandatory credential, 14-year-old Wolfgang and his father arrived in Rome. They attended a deeply solemn service at the Sistine Chapel, setting the stage for the legendary Sistine Chapel heist. Wolfgang sat in the chapel and heard Gregorio Allegri's Miserere. This was not a simple hymn. It was a highly complex, 9-part polyphonic choral masterpiece. The Vatican guarded the physical sheet music with the same level of security a modern government guards its intelligence assets. For over a century, the papacy had decreed that anyone caught copying the Miserere or smuggling a transcription outside the church would face immediate excommunication. It was a closely guarded state secret, designed to preserve the divine mystique of papal services during Holy Week. The threat of eternal damnation in hellfire was very real for a boy raised in a rigidly Catholic household. Yet, Wolfgang listened to this massive, swirling architecture of 9 independent vocal lines, weaving over and under each other just one single time. He walked out, went back to his lodging, sat down at a desk, and perfectly wrote out the entire complex score from memory. It is mind-bending. It's like looking at the interface of a complex software program for 10 minutes and flawlessly writing out the millions of lines of proprietary source code just from having watched the screen. Mechanically, he wasn't memorizing note by note because his neural pathways were completely saturated with musical structure from age 3. He had internalized the complex grammar of Western musical theory, like a bilingual child absorbs syntax. His brain immediately recognized the underlying chord progressions, the mathematical rules of counterpoint governing the 9 voices, and the overarching architectural structure. He didn't memorize the paint. He memorized the math of the canvas. Instead of the Pope sending the Swiss Guard to arrest and excommunicate him, Pope Clement XIV was utterly floored, recognizing a display of pure cognitive genius. The Pope knighted the 14-year-old into the Order of the Golden Spur, However, receiving this highly public validation from the highest spiritual authority in Europe established a massive, inescapable psychological conflict. When you are a knighted, globally recognized prodigy, paraded before monarchs, you simply cannot happily return to your provincial hometown to work a subservient, minimum-wage desk job. This massive ego collision inevitably set the stage for the ultimate clash with authority and a literal kick in the arse that would change music history forever. Following his extensive travels, Mozart was forced to return to his provincial hometown of Salzburg. The previous employer of the Mozart family had been a relatively tolerant archbishop who enthusiastically supported and funded their extended European tours. However, this patron had passed away, replaced by Prince Archbishop Hieronymus von Colloredo, a man operating on a completely different philosophical wavelength. Colloredo was an ardent reformist, deeply influenced by the pragmatic principles of the Enlightenment, seeking to modernize his state. He wanted absolute efficiency, stripping away excess, simplifying the church liturgy, mandating shorter musical masses, and drastically cutting down on bloated court expenditures. Furthermore, he was a strict autocrat who demanded absolute, unquestioning subservience from his state employees. This was an environment fundamentally incompatible with a teenage genius. Colloredo formally appointed Mozart as the court organist and concertmaster. But the financial compensation was frankly insulting, starting at a mere 150 florins and eventually capping at 450 florins. To give you some economic context, and we will break down the true scale of his later wealth shortly, 450 florins was barely a living wage, let alone the salary of an internationally renowned superstar. But the financial sting was nothing compared to the daily, grinding disrespect. Colloredo treated Mozart not as an artist, but as a literal domestic servant. We have furious, venomous letters Mozart wrote to his father, complaining bitterly about the seating arrangements at the archbishop's dining table. Mozart was forced to sit below the valets, grouped fundamentally with the domestic help. The Pope had knighted this young man, and Colloredo was making him eat lunch with the footman. The indignity was severely compounded by economic restrictions. Colloredo explicitly forbade Mozart from moonlighting, refusing to let him perform at highly lucrative private engagements for the local nobility. Mozart knew and proved that he could easily earn half his annual Salzburg salary in a single evening by playing a private concert for wealthy aristocrats. This simmering tension finally reached its boiling point in the spring of 1781. Colloredo had traveled to Vienna to attend the accession of Emperor Joseph II, summoning his retinue of musicians, including Mozart, to attend him in the capital. Putting Mozart back in Vienna was like throwing gasoline on a fire. This was the city where he tasted real freedom and adoration, where the high society nobility absolutely loved him and wanted him performing in their salons. He received a massive offer to play for the emperor himself at the home of Countess Thun, an event promising immense prestige and a huge payout. Colloredo simply said no, ordering Mozart to stay in his quarters. So, Mozart did what any fed-up, undervalued, hyper-aware genius would do. He tried to quit. It became the most dramatic, high-stakes resignation in musical history. Mozart formally submitted his resignation, but Colloredo, demanding to control the narrative and his subjects, initially refused to accept it. In response, Mozart engaged in a campaign of deliberate, escalating insubordination. He intentionally missed scheduled court appointments and openly defied the archbishop's orders by dining at various aristocratic houses without seeking permission. He was practically begging to be fired. Finally, the situation imploded in June 1781. Mozart arrived at the archbishop's quarters to present his resignation in person one last time. The chief steward intercepted him, refusing to grant him an audience. The two men engaged in a violent, heated verbal argument in the antechamber, which ended with the steward physically laying hands on Mozart, throwing him out of the room, and administering a literal, physical kick to Mozart's backside to propel him out the door. Picture the sheer absurdity of that historical moment. The man whose brain contained the symphonies and operas that would define the Enlightenment, physically booted out of a doorway by an exasperated 18th century middle manager. It is the historical equivalent of a senior engineer walking out of a deeply toxic, highly restrictive corporate tech job to launch a wildly risky independent startup. But we must pause and look at the actual mechanism of this conflict. Was Colorado actually an evil, jealous tyrant, or just a practical state administrator trying to manage an impossibly arrogant, perpetually rule-breaking creative employee who refused to adhere to basic company policy? This is a crucial, deeply necessary historical reframing. Colorado has been unfairly caricatured as a one-dimensional villain. In reality, he was a highly pragmatic, capable leader attempting to run a complex ecclesiastical state efficiently. He was not ignorant of music. He genuinely recognized Mozart's exceptional talent and even occasionally played the violin alongside him in the court orchestra. However, from an administrative perspective, he was paying a state employee for exclusive services. That employee was constantly demanding special exemptions, requesting extended multi-month leaves of absence to travel, and acting entirely above his designated social station. To a feudal lord attempting to maintain order, Mozart's constant insubordination was a fundamental threat to the established socio-economic hierarchy. That physical kick out the door, that violent rejection of the hierarchy, serves as a massive, seismic turning point in the mechanics of music history. It is widely considered the exact moment the modern independent artist was born. Up until 1781, professional musicians were essentially categorized as highly skilled domestic servants, their survival entirely dependent on the patronage system. They were legally bound to aristocratic families or ecclesiastical courts who dictated what they wrote, when they played, and who owned their work. Mozart was one of the very first major historical composers to explicitly, aggressively sever those feudal ties, attempting to survive purely as a freelance professional, operating in a volatile, open commercial market. And how did his father, Leopold, the architect of this entire career, react to his son's historic declaration of independence? Leopold was absolutely horrified, siding completely and unequivocally with Archbishop Colorado. He bombarded Wolfgang with furious, emotionally manipulative letters, demanding he immediately apologize to the Archbishop and return to his subservient post in Salzburg. The ultimate stage parent panicked when he lost control of his greatest asset. Leopold deployed extreme emotional blackmail, explicitly claiming that Wolfgang's reckless rebellion was causing both him and Nannerl to become physically ill with grief and anxiety. He was terrified of losing his proxy status and steady, predictable income. But Mozart completely held his ground. He refused to go back, officially establishing himself in Vienna as a freelancer. And this incredibly risky economic move completely shatters the single biggest, most pervasive myth about his life. The myth that he lived and died as a starving pauper. The primary narrative engine of the film Amadeus, the idea that Mozart lived in abject, freezing poverty, entirely misunderstood and unappreciated by the Viennese public, is fundamentally, demonstrably false. Let us actually examine the financial ledgers, because when you read the raw numbers from the 18th century sources, the scale of his success is staggering. For a very significant portion of his decade in Vienna, Mozart generated an immense amount of wealth. In the 1780s, during his peak freelance years, Mozart was generating up to 10,000 florins a year. To truly understand the purchasing power of a florin, A standard hard-working common laborer in Vienna at the time earned about 25 florins for an entire year's work. Joseph Haydn, who was considered highly successful and securely employed by the fabulously wealthy Esterhazy family, made a comfortable 200 florins a year. A senior, highly educated hospital surgeon in Vienna brought in about 1,200 florins. Mozart was pulling in 10,000, 8 times what a top-tier surgeon made. That placed him firmly, unequivocally, in the top 5% of Viennese society. He generated this massive income stream through a brilliant, diversified portfolio. He charged exorbitant fees, giving private piano lessons to the daughters of the highest nobility. He organized and performed in his own subscription concerts, where he controlled the ticketing and kept the vast majority of the box office receipts. And he took on highly paid, prestigious commissions for operas and chamber music. He was the absolute most sought-after cultural commodity in the empire. The crisis we see later in his life is not a crisis of low earning power. It is a crisis of catastrophic, almost pathological financial mismanagement. He generated the wealth of a titan, but he spent it with the complete lack of impulse control of someone falling into the trap of aristocratic mimicry. He couldn't just be an artist. He had to live like the lords he worked for. He rented massive, sprawling, luxurious apartments in the very center of Vienna. We have the receipts. His rent alone was 460 florins a year, which is more than double what Haydn made in total. He purchased a top-of-the-line, custom-built Anton Walter 480 piano for 900 florins. He bought a professional-grade billiard table for 300 florins just to put in his living room. He kept a staff of multiple servants, sent his young son to an absurdly expensive elite boarding school, and even bought a horse and a personal carriage. He was aggressively attempting to maintain the lifestyle of the hereditary aristocracy, but entirely lacked the multi-generational inherited land wealth required to sustain it. The inherent vulnerability of the freelance model is that your cash flow is violently tethered to the macroeconomic stability of the market. In 1788, the Viennese market collapsed as the Austrian Empire engaged in the Austro-Turkish War. This conflict was a massive, expensive, draining endeavor. The wealthy aristocratic patrons who reliably paid for Mozart's premium lessons and expensive concert tickets either fled the capital for their rural estates to avoid wartime inflation, or drastically slashed their discretionary art spending to support the war effort. The revenue stream dried up almost overnight, but Mozart fundamentally refused to downsize his massive overhead. He wouldn't sell the horse, he wouldn't fire the servants, and he wouldn't give up the lifestyle. This forced him into a corner, producing the infamous begging letters. There is a highly documented series of 21 increasingly desperate, pleading letters that Mozart wrote to Johann Michael von Puchberg, a highly successful, wealthy Viennese textile merchant, and, critically, a fellow Freemason. Mozart leveraged this philosophical and fraternal bond relentlessly, extracting loans ranging from 30 florins to massive sums of 500 florins, ultimately accumulating a debt of over 1,400 florins. The psychological manipulation in these letters is a masterclass in guilt. He wrote incredibly dramatic passages, weaponizing their secret society vows for cash, stating, "I have acted as a true brother. I take you to be a man who will assist a friend if you'd be a true friend, or his brother if he'd be indeed a brother." It perfectly mirrors a modern celebrity who goes bankrupt, but absolutely refuses to give up their private jet leases, constantly demanding bailouts from wealthy friends to keep up appearances. This behavior sparked an intense debate among historical musicologists. Did Mozart genuinely experience grinding poverty, or did he deliberately exaggerate his destitution to Puchberg to maintain liquidity? A brilliant deep dive into the city's housing registers by a prominent researcher uncovered a shocking truth. During the exact period, Mozart was writing his most desperate, tear-stained letters to Puchberg, claiming he was entirely destitute and had been forced to move to the suburbs to save money. He had not actually downsized his lifestyle in any meaningful way. The archives proved that Mozart simply rented a different, highly spacious, multi-room apartment that still cost a hefty 250 florins a year. He maintained his servant staff and kept his carriage. He wasn't starving in a garret. He was experiencing a severe cash flow bottleneck, strictly because he refused to give up his luxury lifestyle. Medical historians and psychological biographers have heavily analyzed the underlying mechanism driving this erratic behavior. They pair his chronic, impulsive overspending with documented periods of extreme, superhuman creative output. Like the summer he wrote his final 3 massive symphonies in a matter of weeks, without a single commission prompting him. Several experts suggest these are classic textbook symptoms of cyclothymia, a milder form of bipolar disorder. The manic, sleepless highs resulting in incredible bursts of creative output, immediately followed by deep depressive lows and impulsive, reckless financial behavior, map neatly onto the timeline of his life. However, other highly respected scholars push back fiercely against retroactively diagnosing historical figures with modern psychiatric labels. They argue that Mozart's spending habits do not require a pathological explanation. They can be fully explained by his sociocultural conditioning. He had been raised from infancy as a peer to royalty, his entire identity built on the premise that he deserved to inhabit elite spaces. To him, luxury was just the baseline. To publicly downsize, sell his piano, or fire his servants would have been a public admission of social and professional failure. For a man with his colossal ego, maintaining the illusion of success was fundamentally more important than actual solvency. It is the ultimate destructive trap of keeping up appearances. And this incredibly erratic, contradictory financial behavior is a perfect mirror for the deep contradictions within his personality, leading to a profound, shocking discovery when we strip away the marble pedestal and peer directly into his unfiltered personal correspondence. We have a vast collection of surviving personal correspondence, particularly the letters written to his cousin, Maria Anna Tekla Mozart, often referred to as the Besla letters. These letters are completely saturated with juvenile, scatological humor. He employs incredibly vulgar language, constructs elaborate pages-long jokes centered entirely around bodily functions, and even composed actual musical canons. Intricate, overlapping round songs meant for his educated friends to sing at parties. With titles and lyrics so explicitly profane, they are entirely unprintable in formal textbooks. We are talking about a man who literally composed a highly structured, mathematically perfect vocal piece titled Lek mich am Arsch, which translates exactly to the physical act you assume it translates to. It is pure, unfiltered frat house humor. For decades, historians and medical professionals were so bewildered by the stark contrast between the music and the man that a formal medical theory emerged. Reputable journals published papers suggesting that Mozart must have suffered from a severe neurological condition, specifically Tourette's syndrome. The hypothesis was that these sudden, vulgar outbursts in his written letters and verbal conversations were not intentional jokes, but uncontrollable neurological tics, specifically coprolalia, associated with Tourette's. However, rigorous historical and sociocultural analysis of the period has thoroughly and unequivocally debunked this medical theory. When historians examined the broader cultural landscape of 18th century Central Europe, particularly within the middle class, Catholic communities of southern Germany and Austria, they found that heavy scatological humor was surprisingly normalized. It was not viewed as a pathological symptom or evidence of moral decay. It was a culturally accepted, highly common form of intimate, informal bonding. Even Mozart's mother, a perfectly respectable woman, regularly utilized the exact same toilet humor in her own surviving letters. For a family who spent their entire public lives meticulously conforming to the rigid, suffocating, and hyperpolite protocols of various aristocratic courts, writing these absurd, vulgar letters to each other was a necessary psychological release valve. He wasn't suffering from an uncontrollable neurological disorder. He just genuinely enjoyed the comedic sensibilities of a 13-year-old boy. What makes his brain so incredibly fascinating is that simultaneously, on the exact same days he is writing those letters, he is deeply, passionately engaged in the highest levels of serious Enlightenment philosophy. Freemasonry, in the late 18th century, was not merely a networking club. It was a massive, highly influential intellectual and social movement that attracted the most progressive thinkers, artists, scientists, and forward-thinking aristocrats of the era. The lodges were dedicated to exploring and promoting core Enlightenment ideals like liberty, fraternity, equality, secular rationalism, and moral self-improvement. Mozart officially joined the Beneficence Lodge in Vienna in 1784, throwing himself into the philosophy and quickly rising to the rank of Master Mason. This intellectual influence deeply penetrated the mechanics of his music, culminating in what is arguably his greatest theatrical masterpiece, the opera The Magic Flute. Fundamentally, the opera is a massive Masonic allegory, heavily encoded with specific symbolism. The prominence of the number 3, representing the 3 degrees of Masonry, is baked into the architecture. The overture opens with 3 massive chords. The key signature features 3 flats, and there are 3 mystical boys and 3 ladies. The entire narrative arc is a metaphorical journey of initiation, depicting the characters moving from a state of superstitious darkness into the illuminating light of reason, wisdom, and brotherhood. Mechanically, you have a human brain capable of writing elaborate, rhyming toilet jokes to his cousin on a Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, translating the highest, most complex philosophical ideals of the Enlightenment into a mathematically perfect musical score. Speaking of the friction between his humanity and his genius, there is a legendary historical encounter from this exact period in Vienna that we absolutely must dissect. The highly debated 1787 meeting between Mozart and a 16-year-old prodigy named Ludwig van Beethoven. The traditional narrative, codified by a prominent 19th century biographer, asserts that a fiercely talented Beethoven traveled from Bonn to Vienna with the express purpose of securing an audition with Mozart. Supposedly, when Beethoven began to improvise, Mozart assumed he had simply memorized a showpiece and reacted with cool indifference. Sensing this, Beethoven demanded an original theme to improvise upon. Mozart, deciding to test the boy, gave him a brutally complex, hidden chromatic motif. Beethoven supposedly improvised upon it so brilliantly that Mozart quietly whispered to his gathered friends, "Keep your eyes on him. Someday he will give the world something to talk about." It is the ultimate cinematic passing of the musical torch. But does the historical evidence hold up? Modern historical scholarship is highly skeptical. Verified travel records confirm the 16-year-old Beethoven was indeed physically present in Vienna for about 10 weeks in the early spring of 1787. However, there is not a single piece of contemporary written documentation proving the 2 men ever actually occupied the same room. A leading biographical analyst provides a necessary reality check regarding Mozart's life during those specific 10 weeks. Mozart's life was in a state of absolute chaotic overload. Psychologically, He was dealing with the impending death of his domineering father, Leopold. Professionally, he was frantically preparing for a major trip to Prague and was in the early, grueling stages of conceptualizing the complex architecture of Don Giovanni. Financially, he was deeply stressed, constantly seeking loans, and he already had a 9-year-old musical prodigy, Johann Nepomuk Hummel, physically living in his apartment as a full-time student. He fundamentally lacked the time, financial incentive, and emotional bandwidth to take on another young prodigy. The tragedy compounds because Beethoven received word that his own mother was dying of tuberculosis, forcing him to abruptly rush back to Bonn. By the time Beethoven finally returned to Vienna permanently, in 1792, Mozart was already dead. Which brings us to the final, incredibly dark, and wildly misunderstood chapter, 1791. What is often forgotten is that this year actually began with immense professional and financial promise. His economic situation was stabilizing. The Magic Flute was a massive box office triumph, and he was actively receiving lucrative new commissions and annual stipends. However, as autumn set in, his physical health began to fail with terrifying speed. Amidst this physical decline, an anonymous masked stranger literally showed up at his door and commissioned a Catholic Mass for the dead, a requiem. Mozart, his body failing and mind clouded by fever, became deeply paranoid, confessing to his wife, Constanze, his conviction that he had been poisoned and was writing the requiem for his own impending funeral. That documented paranoia laid the fertile groundwork for the indestructible Salieri myth, the absolute fiction that he was intentionally murdered by his professional rival, the Italian court composer Antonio Salieri. This malicious rumor originated in a Berlin newspaper just a week after Mozart's death. It was later romanticized into a stage play by Alexander Pushkin, an opera by Rimsky-Korsakov, and served as the central narrative pillar for Peter Schaffer's brilliant but entirely historically inaccurate play and film, Amadeus. We must definitively set the record straight. There is zero historical, documentary, or medical evidence to support the poisoning theory. Salieri possessed absolutely no motive. He was a highly respected, deeply entrenched, and massively successful imperial court composer who held the exact prestigious positions Mozart coveted. The rampant, baseless rumors of murder completely devastated Salieri in his later years, contributing severely to his mental decline. The identity of the creepy masked stranger is entirely known to history. He was simply an emissary, acting on behalf of Count Franz von Walsegg, a wealthy amateur musician and a massive plagiarist. Walsegg possessed a highly unethical habit of secretly commissioning complex works from master composers, paying them handsomely for their silence, and passing the compositions off as his own original creations. He commissioned the requiem to honor his recently deceased wife, fully intending to take the credit for writing it. There was no murderous plot. It was just aristocratic vanity and copyright theft. So what actually killed him on December 5th, 1791, at the young age of 35? His official death certificate recorded the cause as Hitziges Frieselfieber, translating to severe miliary fever. In 18th century medical terminology, this meant absolutely nothing. It was merely a description indicating a high fever and a rash of tiny, millet seed-shaped bumps on the skin. Because the official record is so clinically ambiguous, medical professionals over the last 2 centuries have proposed over 118 different specific causes of death in peer-reviewed literature. Theories range from late-stage syphilis, fatally mistreated with toxic mercury, to trichinosis contracted from eating severely undercooked pork chops, amazingly based on a surviving letter where Mozart bragged about eating pork cutlets, con gusto. There is even a theory involving a subdural hematoma caused by a severe fall, based on a skull currently held in the Mozarteum Foundation, purportedly rescued from his grave by a gravedigger years later. Anthropological analysis reveals a partially healed fracture, but establishing the absolute provenance of the skull is highly problematic. Consequently, the most rigorous modern consensus relies on statistics from a comprehensive 2009 epidemiological study conducted by a leading research team. By analyzing the municipal death records of thousands of ordinary Viennese citizens, they discovered a localized epidemic during the winter of 1791, where younger men were dying at a markedly increased rate, exhibiting the exact same horrifying constellation of symptoms that Mozart had. Thanks to the surviving written accounts of his sister-in-law, who was present at his deathbed, we know his symptoms in terrifying detail: a massive soaring fever, crippling back pain, and severe edema, massive, uncontrollable fluid retention. His body became so grotesquely swollen with fluid that he couldn't make the smallest movement without agonizing pain, and his clothes had to be cut off him. The epidemiological consensus is that Mozart contracted a highly virulent streptococcal infection that triggered a devastating autoimmune response known as post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. Mechanically, the antibodies mistakenly attacked the filtering units in his kidneys, causing acute, catastrophic renal failure. Because his body could no longer filter toxins or excrete water, it led to massive fluid retention and terminal uremia. The standard medical treatments of 1791 absolutely guaranteed his death. His primary physician, who delayed coming to the deathbed because he wanted to finish watching a play at the theater, prescribed sudden freezing cold compresses directly to his violently feverish body, likely sending his failing system into immediate physiological shock. More devastatingly, operating on the theory that fever was caused by an excess of blood, they engaged in aggressive bloodletting. The records indicate they systematically drained nearly 2 liters of blood from him, almost half the entire blood volume of a human body. They took an anemic man fighting kidney failure and pushed him into hypovolemic shock. Even after this horrifying medical death, the final indignity that cemented his reputation as a tragic victim was his burial. The Hollywood narrative insists Constance abandoned him, and his body was thrown into a muddy common grave for paupers. This is universally misunderstood. Under the sweeping Enlightenment reforms of Emperor Joseph II, grand funerals and private family crypts within the city walls were strictly banned for urban hygiene and the philosophical belief in equality in death. The law dictated a third-class funeral with burial in a communal, unmarked plot at the St. Mark's Cemetery, located far outside the city limits. This was the standard, legal, highly respectable burial practice for 99% of all Viennese citizens. Constanze was not being cheap or neglectful. She was simply, legally, burying her husband according to strict municipal regulations. Furthermore, the cinematic image of the lonely wooden cart rolling out in the freezing rain is purely romanticized fiction. It was not the cultural custom for mourners, particularly women, to follow the coffin on the arduous journey outside the city walls. The mourning happened at the church, not at the graveside. Why do we fiercely cling to the dramatic fiction that he was poisoned or died starving in the gutter? Because a random, completely mundane bacterial infection feels far too meaningless for a genius of his caliber. We subconsciously demand that the death of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart be as operatic, dramatic, and momentous as his life and his symphonies. Human beings struggle deeply to reconcile the existence of extraordinary, almost divine genius with the brutal, fragile reality of ordinary mortality. The enduring myths of murder, jealousy, and tragic poverty provide a sense of grand, tragic architecture that elevates his life from a biological reality into a martyrdom for the sake of art. What an absolutely incredible, perspective-altering journey we have been on today. We tracked him from his origins as a heavily managed child prodigy, surviving the disease-ridden roads of Europe, analyzed his impossible feats of memory, witnessed him violently rebel against the feudal system to become the very first modern independent freelance musician, and dismantled the pervasive myth of his poverty using financial ledgers. We explored the fascinating duality of his mind and demystified his tragic, agonizing end, replacing operatic poisonings and fictionalized paupers' graves with the harsh medical realities of 18th century epidemiology and municipal burial laws. He emerges as a highly paid, fiercely independent, brilliant, deeply flawed, and aggressively human individual who fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of Western culture through his absolute, unyielding insistence on living as an independent artist on his own uncompromising terms. But before we officially close the book, I want to leave you with one final haunting mystery. We talked about how Wolfgang's sister, Nannerl, was the original prodigy, a phenomenal talent who didn't just play but composed. Wolfgang praised her compositions in his letters, telling her how beautiful her work was. Yet, not a single piece of Nannerl Mozart's music has ever been found. It is a massive, historical blind spot. Imagine if, somewhere in an attic in Austria, a manuscript exists that proves the other Mozart prodigy was just as brilliant as her brother. If we found Nannerl's music tomorrow, what would that mean for the entire history of music? If you enjoyed this journey into the sources and love peeling back the thick layers of Hollywood fiction to uncover the much more complex, fascinating truth underneath, please make sure to hit that like button, share this with your fellow history and music lovers, and subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled. We rely entirely on your support so we can keep bringing you the untamed, unvarnished truth behind history's greatest figures. Thank you for joining us, and keep questioning the story.